Okay, I think that we are going to get started. We are hitting our landmark number, so we are going to go ahead and welcome you to the Kessler Lecture for 2020, Queer and Trans Liberation and the Critique of Fascism, or When Star Met Cesar, and the Frankfurt School honoring Roderick Ferguson. Welcome to everyone who has arrived. My name is Shanta Smith-Cruz. I am the Associate Dean for Teaching, Learning, and Engagement at NYU Division of Libraries. And I am going to turn on my camera and introduce our board co-chair alongside myself, Debanuj Dasgupta. Debanuj, turn on your camera so we can see you and say hello.
Can you see me? Hi, everybody.
Hello, hello. We're dropping links into the chat if you would like to tweet and or acknowledge on social media. And before we do any additional acknowledgements, but please definitely we kept the chat on so that you could communicate with each other online. If you could see the list of names in the room, you would be excited to say hello. So please introduce yourself so that people know that you're here. Before we do any additional acknowledgements, we want to acknowledge the land that we are on, because we are in this very odd virtual space. Debanuj, why don't you start?
Hi, everybody. My name is Debanuj Dasgupta. As you saw, if you read on the screen, I'm Debanuj Dasgupta, Assistant Professor of Feminist Studies at University of California, Santa Barbara. And I am an Indian queer, gender queer person. Today, I'm wearing a gold pendant, gold zari and dark chocolate brown shawl, and I'm mostly coffee brown color. And I'm speaking from New Delhi, India, which is the nation's capital. I want to acknowledge that while many of us know of India as a former British colony, but we have thousands of years of history of multiple settler empires. And I am part, my ancestors are part of that kind of settler empire. And we have displaced the indigenous people of this land. Or as in the case of Northeast India or Kashmir, many of the indigenous settlers of this land are under military surveillance and or occupation. So I wanted to acknowledge that I'm speaking from a contested space. As I speak, there is farmers' strikes going on throughout the country demanding the government's action on different farming communities in India. But I wanted to welcome everybody to CLAGS, the Center for Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, Queer Studies at the City University of New York. And as many of you know, we were founded in 1991, and this is the first university-based research center in the United States. CLAGS's work hovers around three sort of main areas. Our public programs, we are very proud of our public programming. We organize, actually during the COVID, we have had regular programming. One of the first online town hall about trans communities and the impact of COVID within trans communities. We recently did an amazing webinar about queer CRIP studies. So public programs, we keep it free and accessible within New York City. And now the virtual medium allows us to reach many of you throughout the country, throughout the world. Conferences, as many of you who are in queer and transgender studies will know, some of the most definitive texts in our field have come out from CLAGS conferences. For instance, the Queer Globalizations Conference in 1999, the After Gay Marriage Conference in 2006, the Queers and Comics Conference, the Homo Nationalism Conference, you can name as many. And we work to organize this and keep them accessible for the public. CLAGS is a cutting-edge space of scholarship, a meeting ground of sorts between cultural workers, artists, academics, and activists. And this I personally can attest. When I lived and organized in New York as an undocumented immigrant, CLAGS was the space for me to come and listen and engage with academic colleagues and create this public space. Fellowships and awards, for instance, our award ceremony today, Kessler, it is one of the endowed awards that we give out every year. Most definitely our most prestigious award given to a recipient who has made an impact, sustained scholarship in our field. So we are very proud to welcome Professor Roderick Ferguson today. But there are many other fellowships that we give out that are not endowed. As Sean is taking us through, the Graduate Student Paper Award, the Undergraduate Student Paper Award, the Student Travel Award. These are fellowships given, awards given within to CUNY students. And as you know, CUNY is one of the nation's largest public education, urban-based public education systems, very much hit by COVID. So any of your support today will help us fund queer and trans studies within CUNY students. The Sylvia Rivera Award in Transgender Studies. This year's participant awardees are B. Kaminga and Arina Zura for their pathbreaking work in transmigration studies. Also the CLAGS Fellowships, which allows people to work from a dissertation to a book or their first book award. Any of these helps in these disturbing times to keep critical queer and trans studies alive. So what I would welcome today, Sean and I would like for y'all today, is as you go through our website, as you listen to our testimonial speakers and to our awardee, Professor Ferguson, we would like to see 10 of you give $100. That would really fund half of the CLAGS Fellowship or most of the Sylvia Rivera Award for this year for transgender studies. And I encourage you to donate on the top button there. And please let us know in chat that you're donating. We'll keep a tab and announce how much we raised today. I just want to crucially sort of reiterate the point that we work within one of the most beleaguered public education systems in the country. And we have been doing a lot of work recently within CUNY campuses around LGBTQ studies, supporting transgender scholars, academics, staff, and students within CUNY, as well as planning for CLAGS' 30th. Sean, do you want to speak a little bit about CLAGS' 30th as we move on to you?
Sure. Thanks, Devanuj. I also wanted to definitely say that CLAGS is located in New York City on Lenape territories, and we want to acknowledge that we are a part of an institutional problem, and so we want to think about solutions, and that's why I'm excited we're talking about liberation today, because we're constantly on that struggle. And so as Devanuj pointed out, your donations would help support us moving into our 30th year of this work of enhancing and promoting LGBTQ studies, queer studies, trans studies to a wider publics, and to collaborating with our artists and activists across the nation and internationally. So if you look at our website here, there is a donate button on the side, and right now it links to the Graduate Center webpage. So feel free to go in there. We would love to get donations today, because this is really the way that CLAGS has been operating in the 30 years that it's been around. We rely on individual donations and individual support. So I'm going to go ahead and put that link into the chat so that you have it. And
Oh, could I just say one more thing?
Or
Since we are at the Kessler Awards, so we are about to celebrate 30 years of CLAGS. And one of the projects that's related to the Kessler Awards is that the past 20 years of Kessler awardees, their lectures, and they get to each reflect on their lectures. We'll be also doing a couple of roundtables in spring, so look forward to our programming in spring, where a select few will come together to talk about queer studies now at this juncture. And all of that will be put together in a Kessler anthology that is about to come out soon in this process. That's one of the ways we are committed to producing collaborative knowledge. And the second thing I wanted to point out, Sean and I are about to introduce our executive director, Justin Brown. And Justin Brown, Sean will speak more about Justin, but I wanted to point out that Justin Brown, Dr. Justin Brown, is the second ED of color in the history of CLAGS, which is the kind of work that CLAGS has been doing, holding up the scholarship of Black, Indigenous, people of color scholars. Our board, our staff, our commitment to this work reflects that.
thank you, Devanush. And yes, CLAGS is entering its Saturn return, so we're very excited about that. So thank you. And we're also, because of that, working toward our archival works. And so you'll hear more about that on our list. So please also make sure you're on our email list if you're not already. Oops. Let's try next slide. So we're so excited to welcome who is going to introduce the program, Dr. Justin T. Brown, who is an associate professor of health sciences and program director for Public and Community Health Associative Sciences program at LaGuardia Community College at CUNY. Justin's collaborative research focuses on addressing health and inequities among persons of color, LGBTQ youth, and those populations at the intersection through asset-based approaches. And prior to CLAGS, Dr. Brown was the deputy director of the CUNY Institute for Health and Equity and worked for several years running one of the only national social service agencies dedicated exclusively to working with LGBTQ youth of color. So I'm not going to belabor Justin's long introduction, but I'm going ahead and turn my camera off and ask Justin to turn his on so that you can hear from Justin.
Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be here tonight, celebrating and honoring Dr. Roderick Ferguson with all of you. I want to first just tell you a little bit of background on the Kessler Award, and additionally what the outline for our sequence of events will be this evening. So the Kessler Award is our most prestigious honor here at CLAGS. The board selected recipient is a scholar whose contributions and body of work have left an indelible mark on the interdisciplinary field of LGBTQ studies. Past recipients have included Barbara Smith, John D'Amelio, Sherry Moraga, Kathy Cohen, Sarah Ahmed, and most recently, Jasbir Pawar, just to name a few of the eminent scholar activists. As you can see here on this particular slide, this is our actual program for this evening. And Sean will be putting that link into the chat, so you will be able to access that and download that for your own purpose. In terms of this evening, the specific structure briefly of how we will move through the order of tonight's events. We'll begin by hearing from a few of Dr. Ferguson's friends and colleagues. Each will provide a testimonial about Roderick's work and his legacy. Then this will be followed by the introduction of Dr. Ferguson and his lecture for this evening. Immediately after, we will have a moderated Q&A, then conclude with the presentation of this year's 2020 Kessler Award. We do miss the fact that we are not there in person and we are not all together celebrating, but we certainly know that as we enter, as Devanush spoke so well to, our 30th anniversary and upcoming events, that we will be able to honor Roderick and all the other past recipients live and in person, hopefully in the new year. So without that further ado, we'll move to our first testimonials for tonight. Our first testimonial this evening will come from Doctors Grace Hong and Chandan Reddy. Grace Hong is a professor of gender studies with a joint appointment in Asian American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. She earned her PhD in literature at UC San Diego and her MA in Asian American Studies at UCLA. Her research focuses on women of color feminism as an epistemological critique of and alternative to Western liberal humanism and capital, particularly as they are manifest as contemporary neoliberalism. Her current work includes situating Asian and Asian diasporic feminism within a genealogy of third world feminism. Dr. Hong is the author of Dead Beyond Disavow, The Impossible Politics of Difference from the University of Minnesota Press, and The Ruptures of American Capital, Women of Color Feminism and the Cultures of Immigrant Labor, also University of Minnesota Press, and the co-editor with Dr. Ferguson of Strange Affinities, The Gender and Sexual Politics of Comparative Racialization, Duke University Press, as well as co-editor with Dr. Ferguson with the Difference Incorporated book series at University of Minnesota Press. Chandan Reddy is associate professor in the Department of Comparative History of Ideas and also the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Washington, Seattle. He is co-editor with Jody Bird, Alicia Goldstein, and Jody Melmed of the special issue Economies of Dispossession, Indigeneity, Race, Capitalism in Social Text in spring 2018. His recent publications include Using Liberal Rights to Enforce Racial Capitalism with Jody Melmed and Insights from the Social Sciences. Convergence, Dissymmetry, Duplicities, Enactments of Queer of Color Critique, the Cambridge Companion to Queer Studies, Siobhan Somerville, editor, Cambridge University Press, Race, Sexuality, and the Black Radical Tradition, GLQ, the Journal of Lesbian and Gay Studies in fall 2018. Dr. Reddy's book, Freedom with Violence, Race, Sexuality in the US State of 2011 from Duke University Press, won the Alan Bray Memorial Award for Queer Studies from the MLA, as well as the Best Book in Cultural Studies from the Asian American Studies Association, both of which were in 2013. His current work includes a new book project titled Administering Racial Capitalism that explores the colonial knowledges and settler repertoires that organize contemporary racial capitalism. At this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Grace Hong and Dr. Chandan Reddy.
Thank you so much. Speaking for both of us, we are delighted to give this testimonial today as our beloved Rod receives this honor. I think Rod asked us to speak at this event because we've known him for so long. So since he and I were in graduate school together at UC San Diego, and Chandan moved back to San Diego while he was a graduate student at Columbia.
Picture it, it's New York and it's 1998. We were both in our 4th year of grad school and Rod had plans to go to New York to do research at the Schomburg. He was looking for a sublet in Harlem, just as I was looking for one in San Diego. Our friends, Grace and Lisa, gave us each other's phone number. We struck up a plan to exchange places, but just weeks before he was supposed to leave for New York and leave me his apartment, Rod's funding fell through. He needed to stay put. So instead of trading places, I got to be Rod's roommate for a year. And this would be the first of many instances where Rod's misfortune would be the best thing that ever happened to me. Since then, of course, Rod and Grace have co-written an article and co-edited an essay collection and are book series editors together.
So I like to call myself the Engels to Rod's Marx.
And Rod and I have been roommates once again, most recently earlier this year, largely because I keep showing up at his doorstep to his great misfortune.
So if we could start the slides. So we thought we would mark this passage of time by showing some photographs of these early years together. Next photograph. But as you can see, my friends just do not age. So at least Chandan has the decency to have a little gray in his hair now, but Rod and Gayatri here insist on remaining annoyingly well preserved. Next photograph, please. So Chandan, when was this? You were on the job market, you and Rod, that year?
I think so.
Yeah. Next slide, please. This is me and Rod in Bulgaria. We don't have a ton of time, so I will, leave any questions about this to the Q&A portion of the evening. Next slide, please. And Chandan made me put these in here because he's just so thirsty. Next slide. Rod, as we know and love him. So one thing these photos do reveal, however, is an enduring characteristic of Rod's, which announces itself through his research, his teaching, and most importantly, his very way of being in the world, his practice of sociality and relationality, which is to say his consistent practice of situating Black queerness within a milieu of varied and various historical formations.
I remember Rod telling me once about how he conceptualized his field-setting, world-changing first book, part of why we're here tonight celebrating his great achievements, Aberrations in Black. He told me, and if you don't know this already about Rod, he talks like your favorite character in a Morrison novel. Everything is in metaphor. I remember asking him how he created a critical field, how he found the shape, the structure, and language for queer of color critique before it even existed. He said, "Oh, that book?" Looking at me like its magic was no mystery at all. You know how Lisa Lowe's Immigrant Acts is basically her version of Capital Volume 1 for Asian American Studies and Diaspora Studies? To which I nodded like that was a metaphor every 6-year-old knew. Well, I said to myself, he continued, Rod, what would an Immigrant Acts for Black Studies look like? And that's how Aberrations came together. You know, it's my Capital Volume 1 as Queer of Color Critique for American Studies. And he sauntered away as if everyone's first book is a rewriting of Marx's 1,000-page tome within the dialectic available to one's own time and place. In every way, though, Aberrations is actually nothing less than that. It's the work of the most acute reader we know who grew up in a rural southern town of Manchester, Georgia, in the heart of what Du Bois called Cotton Kingdom. Fatefully, it's also a town that shares its name with the English city, Manchester, that would soon become the epitome of British colonial capitalism and its global reach by mid-19th century. A city whose wealth came from spinning the cotton Rod's great-great-great-grandparents and their children after them picked as bondsmen and women, and later as sharecroppers, into the textiles that were woven from patterns stolen from India, China, and other parts of the Orient. Marx frequently visited this other Manchester where his bestie, Frederick Ingalls, you know, his Grace Hong, in other words, lived. Ingalls noted of this other Manchester's in ways that illuminate our presence, that its density and obscene wealth inequality spawned, quote, the repeated visitations of epidemics like cholera, typhus, and smallpox, exposing its mostly, end quote, exposing its mostly migrant colonized Irish working classes to what Marx described in Capital as premature death. Capital Volume 1 made globally known the story of this other Manchester, even as it universalized the categories and structures by which it activated the story for freedom movements. For Marx and Engels' Manchester, we know that viruses do in fact discriminate, and that today, Black, Latino, and Indigenous communities are once again bearing the burden of the COVID epidemic and premature death, because they are today's lion's share of the working class and the assetless poor. Like that other capital, Manchester appears in aberrations, obliquely and through a visual metaphor. Rod prefaces the text of Aberrations with a meditation and a 1938 photograph of a segregated railroad facility in Manchester, Georgia, cataloged at the Library of Congress as LC USF 33-00172-MA. Its caption, now its archival tag. 4 African-American men are captured in the picture, a bathroom door behind them with the words colored men written on the door. A metaphor, Rod tells us, for canonical sociology's interest in gender and sexual regulation that issue from racial difference. For all its difference from the Lancashire city detailed in Engels' Conditions of the Working Class, the photo saturated in the American gender and sexual idiom of Jim Crow racial segregation. One of Aberration's insights is reminding us that this picture, the view it offers, the past that it confirms, the sociological critiques that it launched is actually, in the end, more the Manchester of Marx's capital. And yet, Rod writes, quote, I'm pulled to this picture for reasons that straddle distinctions between the epistemological and the personal. I know this railroad station. It's a 10-minute walk from the house I grew up in. I know as well that there are subjects missing who should have been accounted for. The transgender man who wore Levi's and a baseball cap and chewed tobacco, the men with long permed hair who tickled piano leaves, the sissies and bulldaggers who taught the neighborhood children to say their speeches on Easter Sunday morning. Aberrations is a study of how lives like these gender nonconforming Black Manchesterites went missing in the National Archive. It taught us to understand why we know much about the Manchester that Marx and Engels wrote about, especially for those of us in freedom struggles, and even the Manchester, Georgia, their work made into a photograph and metaphor. And yet so little of the Manchester that Rod grew up in, and for which Rod has now helped foster space in ethnic, women's, and American studies departments across the country. This is what Rod termed queer of color critique. It's a way of reading relationally for the formations and histories that go missing among histories and sociologies of freedom that we do have. It's a way of reading perversely for the Manchester, Georgia in Manchester, England, for Black studies in immigrant acts.
For at the same time, Aberrations is written from the perspective of Georgia's, not England's or Engels's, Manchester. Peopled with women whose songs wafted through Rod's household, whose stories contradicted the victors' histories, many of which he heard at his grandmother's lap. These are the stories of sissies leading the church choir, but rather than disappearing, being invited to the picnic, at least in Rod's capacious imagination. As Rod recounted in his American Studies Association presidential address, and yes, he wrote 2 books while also being president of a National Scholars Association. I mean, there were 2 small books though. This is the Manchester of his mother's singing, where his paternal Aunt Betty gave teenage Rod a box filled with books on the Harlem Renaissance one Christmas, where recognizing that Rod, quote unquote, had a talent for expression, various churches in the county contacted Mama to have him read at special occasions, end quote, and where his grandmother, Willie Mae, she of the 4th grade education, gave Rod a run for his money in the voraciousness of her reading. These and others were, quote, part of the general creativity of the Black communities in Manchester, end quote. So that leads us to another enduring characteristic of Rod's. He is fueled by a resistance to and an impatience with any kind of nihilism or despair. Rod responds to any wallowing in abjection with a deeply sympathetic, bless your heart, and then never entertains it ever again. This work ethic and orientation to the world is based on his intellectual and political formation amongst Black folks who are and have always been agential beings, Black communities who had and have and always will have their own ways of nurturing and inspiring intellectualism that created and nourished their own guiding projects and gave Rod the wisdom and language to do the same. It was because of, not despite, this place, these people, that Rod was able to write the Queer of Color version of the Asian American version of Capital Volume 1. Near the close of his presidential address, even before the COVID epidemic was revealed in the United States, Rod offered that audience these final words, quote, "In this moment of increasing repression along the lines of race, gender, transgender, class, sexuality, indigeneity, and immigration status, the mountains and the hills, the rivers and the rocks, the wild animals and the tame, all beseech us at this hour. Gather the best of your traditions," they say, "the foremost of your ancestral medicines, the most life-sustaining dark sayings given to you by loved ones here and gone on. The sky is gray and cloudy and the storm is coming, but you have everything you need," end quote.
It's remarkable that Rod came up with these thoughts even before COVID. And yet this is the other thing about Rod. He actually can tell the future. And the last thing you need to know about Rod before we close is that he loves fashion. So we thank you, Rod, for the traditions from which you write, the medicines and life-sustaining works you give us, but we think your t-shirt deserves the final word. Demand the impossible, because you do just that. We love you, Rod.
Love you, Rod.
Thank you so much, Doctors Hong and Reddy, for those words and for sharing your own experiences, reflections, and just to give some of us a bit of insight into your views. Our second testimonial this evening comes from Dean E. Patrick Johnson. E. Patrick Johnson is Dean of the School of Communication and Annenberg University Professor of Performance Studies and African American Studies at Northwestern University. He is a 2020 inductee into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Johnson is a prolific performer, scholar, and an inspiring teacher whose research in artistry has greatly impacted African American studies, performance studies, as well as gender and sexuality studies. He is the author of Appropriating Blackness, Performance and the Politics of Authenticity, 2003, Sweet Tea, Black Gay Men of the South, An Oral History, 2008, Black, Queer, Southern Women, An Oral History, 2018, and Honeypot, Black Southern Women Who Love Women, 2019. In addition to several edited and co-edited collections, essays, and plays, Johnson's written and performance work dovetail intimately. His staged reading, Pouring Tea, Black Gay Men of the South Tell Their Tales, has toured to over 100 college campuses since 2006. The full-length stage play, Sweet Tea, the play, premiered in Chicago, toured across 8 other cities, and to the National Black Theater Festival. Dean Johnson is also among the subjects and co-executive producer of the film Making Sweet Tea, which has received several awards, including Best LGBTQ Film at the San Diego Film Festival, Best Documentary Audience at the Out on Film Festival, and the Silver Image Award from the Association of American Retired Persons for positive representation of LGBTQ people over 50 at the Chicago Reeling LGBTQ Film Festival. Please welcome Dean E. Patrick Johnson.
I am so excited to be here to honor Rod. It's hard to believe that it's been 21 years since I first met Rod. He was a graduate student at UC San Diego, where I was interviewing for a position in the departments of English and theater. And some of the people who are on this Zoom, including Daphne Brooks and Jack Halberstam and Lisa Lowe, were all on the faculty there at the time. But he and Chandan Reddy, who was visiting, as he just said, cornered me to give me the local tea on who's who and who ain't at UCSD. While I did not get the job, he and I remained in touch over the years as we both landed in the Midwest, he in Minneapolis and me in Chicago. And then for 5 years, we were in Chicago together when he moved to UIC. It was during those 5 years that he and I became even closer as we started a tradition of celebrating our birthdays together every March 1st. Both Pisceans, we feel deeply and we dish deeply. And this made for some wonderfully mischievous birthday meals. This past year, we still celebrated our birthdays together via Zoom and from the other side of the world, as I was in Australia and he in New Haven. There were still deep feelings and deep dishing from down under. But in addition to our personal reveries and about how special Rod is to all of us, we are specifically here to celebrate his tremendous contribution to the field of queer studies as we honor him for receiving the Kessler Award. It would be an understatement to say that Rod's scholarship is paradigm shifting, and I don't use those words lightly. He is a deft critic and theorist whose interdisciplinary research has changed the landscape of queer studies, of sociology, of literature on the topic of hegemonic disciplinary formations, as showcased in his first book, Aberrations in Black, Toward a Queer of Color Critique. Indeed, Aberrations has had a monumental impact on the still burgeoning field of Black queer studies, such that it has become one of the most oft-cited texts in the field, and especially the phrase queer of color critique, which Rod coined. As a mode and methodology of analysis, queer of color critique unmasks the so-called transparency of neoliberal discourse that obscures and occludes the intersecting ramifications of race, gender, and class on political economy. Moreover, that book represents an immensely important intervention in sociology, precisely because it demonstrates how canonical sociology, quote, universalized and racialized heteropatriarchy, end quote, despite its codification in the academy as a liberal discipline. For Rod, the African-American novel provides an anecdote to sociological studies of race because of how historically it has been a site of cultural reflexivity that has offered a complex account of Black life. The Black novel is not so much a panacea for misogyny, homophobia, and racism, for it too is implicated in hegemonic ideology, as much as it disrupts sociology's gloss of race, class, and gender. Aberrations is an invaluable contribution to queer and cultural studies as it accomplishes several things. Namely, it provides insight into the origins of neoliberal discourse as it intersects with sexuality, race, and nationalism. Methodologically, it provides a great example of how to do cultural studies within the area of literary studies and American studies. And it deploys queer theory to analyze systemic and structural forms of power in a way seldom done by queer theorists. While Rod's previous works have established him as an influential cultural critic, Perhaps his second monograph, The Reorder of Things on the Institutionalization of Difference, published by University of Minnesota Press, is his most provocative. The Reorder of Things demonstrates his interdisciplinary acumen and his engagement with macro structures of power. An implicit critique of how sociology has theorized student social movements of the 1960s and 1970s as progressive. Rod pulls back the veil on how the academy diluted the power of these movements through what he calls an archival economy, whereby the discourse of inclusion and recognition over repudiation and exclusion actually served as a distraction for the academy's reinscription of hegemony and regulation. Given how sociology, women's studies, and African-American studies have positioned these minoritarian social movements as sacrosanct when recounting the history of the rise of area studies and interdisciplinary studies, this book shakes the foundations of these fields. Rather than a nihilistic recasting of these histories, however, Rod's project is to reveal power's ideological conceit in order that we, quote, critically deploy those modes of difference that have become part of power's trick and devise ways to use them otherwise, end quote. In this way, his work demystifies the operations of power so that we who inhabit minoritarian subjectivities might stave off being co-opted by the lure of neoliberum's promiscuity. And you know I love a good lure, inside the academy and outside of it. And then there is the little book that could, One-Dimensional Queer. Oh, how I love this book. This book is one that I teach every chance I get because it is such an important intervention in queer history that would have us believe that Stonewall was the beginning of queer liberation without the accounting for the number of grassroots efforts that preceded Stonewall, and especially the efforts of queers of color. As usual, Rod exposes the lie of neoliberal efforts to paper over quotidian struggle. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention my favorite essay by Rod that not a lot of people know about. It's called Sissies at the Picnic. In that personal essay, he recounts his Georgia childhood community in which queerness abounded in ways that complicate binaries like out versus in and respectability, as he narrates the story of Black queer rural life. And everybody knows that I can relate to that. If his brilliance weren't enough, he is one of the kindest and most gentle human beings I know. His congenial spirit and leadership acumen have established him as a go-to person in the profession and a must-have person as a friend. I'm so honored to have been asked to provide a testimony on this occasion because I can think of no other more deserving human being to deserve this honor. Congratulations, Rod. Thanks for being another sissy at the picnic.
Thank you so much, Dean Johnson, for your insights and perspectives, and we truly appreciate your words. Our final testimonial this evening comes from Dr. Gayatri Gopna. Gayatri Gopna is a professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis and the director of the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality at New York University. She works at the intersection of transnational feminist and queer studies, post-colonial studies, and diaspora studies, and is the author of 2 monographs, Impossible Desires, Queer Diasporas and South Asian Public Cultures, Duke University Press 2005, and Unruly Visions, The Aesthetic Practices of Queer Diaspora, Duke University Press 2018. Dr. Gopna has published numerous essays on gender, sexuality, and queer diasporic cultural production in journals such as the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies, GLQ, Social Text, and Positions. Please welcome Dr. Gayatri Gapna.
Hi, everyone. I'm so honored and delighted to be celebrating Rod here tonight with all of you, especially with folks whom I love and admire so much, Grace, Chandan, Patrick. It's especially meaningful that we are celebrating Rod here at CLAGS. I'm proud to be a former board member of CLAGS, and I know I speak for many in this virtual room when I say that some of my most formative experiences as a queer scholar happened because of CLAGS. I will never forget attending the historic Black Nations Queer Nations Conference in 1995. It was there that I heard Essex Hemphill read a poem about the exquisite joy and terror of falling in love and facing his own death at the same moment. He would leave this world just 7 months later. It was also there that I experienced the electric energy of a packed auditorium as we listened to Jackie Alexander speak of Black queer diasporic spirituality and say that, quote, "We cannot afford to ignore that which we cannot understand," end quote. One of the very first public talks I ever gave was at the CLAGS Queer Globalizations Conference in 1998, convened by Martin Manalansan and Arnaldo Cruz Malave. I conjure forth these moments and names now as we celebrate Rod's achievements because their spirit animates the pages of his work. They are his precursors, his ancestors, and his fellow travelers. Their wisdom and insights infuse Rod's groundbreaking 2003 book, Aberrations in Black. As we, incredibly enough, near the 20th anniversary of the publication of Aberrations, we can see that Rod's achievement in the book is singular and remarkable, even as he draws on the brilliance of queer of color scholarship, aesthetics, and activism that came before him, that sustains him, and with which he was and continues to be in dialogue. So let me say a bit more about Aberrations. Every once in a blue moon, you come across a book that you know without the trace of a doubt will be paradigm shifting and field defining. That feeling of certainty doesn't happen very often. That sense that you're reading something that is game changing, that will have far reaching consequences, and that will be transformative for many people. I remember experiencing one such moment when I was flying on a plane in 1996, reading Lisa Lowe's introduction to Immigrant Acts. And I had that same sense of dawning excitement when I read the proofs of Aberrations. Here's what I wrote to Rod at the time. This is dated Friday, October 31st, 2003. Rod, just read your chapters and want to say that I am amazed, moved, and in awe of what you've done. As I was reading the intro, the word magisterial came to mind. You've given us this incredible queer racialized critique of Marx, made interventions into multiple fields, deeply engaged with women of color feminism, and made clear how central it is to queer of color scholarship, et cetera, et cetera. I also love your final sentence in the conclusion about moving beyond recognition and visibility to seeing queers of color as sites of knowledge. Really moving and inspiring, actually, for all of us working in the field. Since that moment in 2003, I've read and taught Aberrations many times, and I continue to be amazed, moved, and in awe of Rod's achievement. Reading it again now for this occasion, I'm also struck by how self-assured it is, especially given that this was his first book. Indeed, self-assurance is one of Rod's singular character traits. Let me be clear. This is an assurance that comes not from arrogance or from a sense of exceptionalism. This is an assurance that comes from the certainty that the reason we are here is to do the work, that the work is vital, and that it is a collective project, that it emerges from all those who have come before us and is for all those who will follow us. We all know that origin stories and genealogies are dangerous, but I do want to highlight a few moments in Rod's intellectual, political, and personal formation here. The very first memory I have of Rod is on the pristine campus of UC San Diego in 1997 or 98. There was Rod strolling across campus, his locks swaying in the breeze, looking like he had not a care in the world. Rod was part of a cohort of brilliant graduate students, among them Grace and Chandan, who were drawn to an outstanding group of faculty at UCSD that was committed to transforming disciplinarity in area studies through feminist, ethnic studies, and queer studies frameworks. Folks like Lisa Lowe, George Lipsitz, Jack Halberstam, Rosemary George, Lisa Yonayama, Tak Fujitani, among others. Rod was very much a product of and central contributor to that remarkable constellation of faculty and grad students. I was lucky enough to experience that moment at UCSD. And one detail I remember about Rod at that time was that he was and is a master baker. He would turn out red velvet cakes, fruit pies, all kinds of delectable baked goods in the graduate student apartment that he shared with Chandan. The baking was significant. As Patrick knows, to be a good baker requires care, precision, patience, measurement. It is that same measured, precise, deliberate mode through which Rod carefully builds his arguments so that they are unimpeachable. That is the hallmark of all his work, from Aberrations to his trenchant critique of institutionalization in both The Reorder of Things from 2012 and in We Demand from 2017, to his latest book, One Dimensional Queer from 2019, on the cooptation of the radical intersectional politics of gay liberation. That unhurried, deliberate mode is also how Rod lives his life and moves through the world. I remember visiting him in Chicago in the dead of winter. It was so cold, and I was trying my best to keep to Rod's measured gait as he casually sashayed across campus as if in balmy 80-degree weather when it was actually 10 below freezing. At one point, I just couldn't take it anymore. And I left Rod and sprinted to the nearest building entrance. "I'll meet you inside," I yelled to Rod as I ran. Rod just smiled as he kept on his graceful, relaxed path. I often try to channel Rod completely unsuccessfully when I'm dealing with one stressful situation or another. I remember Rod telling me that when he's dealing with a particularly stressful situation, being stuck in traffic en route to the airport, for instance, he will simply say to himself, "How calm can I be?" Another time I remember fretting to Rod about the excruciatingly slow progress I was making on my book. Rod simply turned to me and said, "You're on your own time, no one else's." That was the best advice I could get, and it got me through the writing of the book, and it's advice that I now share with my students. Rod is most definitely on his own time, and it makes him that rarest of rare breeds, a genuinely unneurotic academic. To me, it's clear that Rod's sense of being on his own time is deeply informed by the queer time and place that is Manchester, Georgia. So if UCSD is one genealogical node in Rod's intellectual journey, Manchester is another. This is Rod's hometown, as you've heard, in southwestern Georgia, which according to the last census has a population of 4,230. Rod has written movingly about Manchester in a pair of autobiographical essays, and I'll turn to them in a minute. What I failed to remember until I went back to Aberrations for this occasion is that Aberrations begins and ends with Manchester. I erroneously remembered Aberrations as beginning with an evocation of the Black trans sex worker from Marlon Riggs's Times Untied. But in fact, Rod begins with the masterful reading of the 1938 photograph of her segregated railroad station in Manchester that Chandan mentioned. Rod asks us to imagine all those who fall outside the frame of the photograph. The sissies and bulldaggers who taught the neighborhood children to say their speeches on Easter Sunday morning. He asks, is there a way in which their emergence can be located within the social formations that the picture represents? And might their presence cause us to reconsider political economy and racial formation as they are normally pursued, end quote. Rod's insistence on seeing and making us see the familiar faces of Black queer subjects in the picture of his hometown is not about engaging in a project of mere visibility, representation, and inclusion. Rather, in Rod's hands, the queer figures who peopled his childhood, his past, and the past of the small Southern town in which he grew up become precisely the sites of knowledge that critique the state, capital, and social science. Rod returns to Manchester in two explicitly autobiographical essays, Sissies at the Picnic that Patrick mentioned, and his ASA presidential address, To Catch a Light-Filled Vision, that Grace mentioned. These are some of my favorite writings from Rod. They are in the tradition of political memoir along the lines of Hazel Carby's Imperial Intimacies or Stuart Hall's Familiar Stranger. The Manchester that Rod recalls from his childhood is replete with memories of the Sissies and the Bulldaggers, as well as of his own Muskogee Creek ancestors, all of whom made up the fabric of everyday rural life. These stories reveal Manchester not as an unmodern, minor, backward site, as nationalist progress narratives would have it. Rather, the Manchester that we see through Rod's eyes is a heterotopic space of colliding temporalities and strange affinities, as he and Grace would later term it in their important 2011 anthology. It is a space that speaks to the heterogeneity of both Blackness and queerness, and that is marked by interconnectedness and interrelationality. There is a clear-eyed sense of possibility, of hopefulness, of alternatives that exist in the interstices of the dominant that suffuse Rod's writing and being. In his work and his being, he insists on meeting life with life, rather than dwelling in the foreclosures. He shows us that if we are armed with our commitment to one another, to our queer ancestors, to those who come after us, to the animate and inanimate worlds that sustain us, we will not only survive, but thrive. Rod tells us, the sky is gray and cloudy and the storm is coming, but you have everything you need. Thank you, darling Rod, for reminding us of this. In the company of your fierce and brilliant words and being, we do indeed have everything we need. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goffna. So without further ado, we have arrived at our main event. So I would like to take this opportunity and all of you in joining me in introducing Dr. Roderick A. Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson is Professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Yale University. He received his BA from Howard University and his PhD from the University of California, San Diego. He is the recipient of the Modern Language Association's Crompton Knoll Award in 2000, which awards the best essay in lesbian, gay, and queer studies in the modern languages, for his article, The Parvenu Baldwin and the Other Side of Redemption. Ferguson served as associate editor of American Quarterly, the Journal of the American Studies Association from 2007 to 2010, and filled the position of department chair in American Studies at the University of Minnesota from 2009 to 2012. Dr. Ferguson served as 2018 president of the American Studies Association. Ferguson previously taught at the University of Illinois, Chicago in the Department of Black Studies and the program in Women and Gender Studies from 2014 to 2019. He is also the co-director of the racialized body research cluster at UIC. An interdisciplinary scholar, his work traverses such fields as American studies, gender studies, queer studies, cultural studies, African American studies, sociology, literature, and education. In addition to numerous articles and essays, he's the author of One Dimensional Queer by Polity in 2019, We Demand, the University and Student Protests, University of California 2017, The Reorder of Things, the University and its Pedagogies of Minority Difference, University of Minnesota Press 2012, and Aberrations in Black, Toward a Queer of Color Critique, University of Minnesota Press 2004. As previously mentioned, he is the co-editor with Dr. Grace Hong of the anthology Strange Affinities, The Gender and Sexual Politics of Comparative Racialization, Duke University, 2011. Dr. Ferguson is also co-editor with Erica Edwards and Jeffrey Akbar of Keywords of African American Studies, NYU, 2018. Currently, he is working on 2 monographs, In View of the Tradition, Art and Black Radicalism, and also The Bookshop of Black Queer Diaspora. Tonight, Dr. Ferguson's Kessler lecture is titled Queer and Trans Liberation and the Critique of Fascism, or When Starr Met Césaire and the Frankfurt School. Again, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Roderick A. Ferguson.
All right, thank you all. This is wonderful. It is amazing. The thing that I've learned most about myself in the time that we've been together is that it's really hard for me to hear people say nice things about me. I could not love you guys more. I really couldn't. And I'm gonna leave it at that because I will be in a puddle otherwise, all right? I am going to fiddle around with this and share the presentation with you, and then we'll get on the way, okay? All right, first let me thank the CLAG's Board of Directors for this great honor. I am keenly aware of the high company that I keep as this year's recipient. I would also like to thank my dear friends, Chandan, Grace, Gayatri, and E. Patrick for their testimonies and for stepping up. I'd also like to thank the numerous friends, family members, students, teachers, and mentors who have made sure that I have never walked alone. And I thank you all for coming this evening. I keep coming back to them, that band of trans women, sex workers who made up Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, or STAR, founded by the Stonewall veterans, Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. There were other groups, to be sure, but something about their conscious connections to groups like the Black Panther Party and the Puerto Rican Young Lords keeps me running after them. In this talk tonight, I hope to keep company not only with them, but also with my esteemed contemporaries who work at the intersections of trans, queer, feminist, ethnic, and Black studies, as well as in the politics and histories of abolition. STAR is for me a rich archive for considering the diverse manifestations of police and fascist orders, as well as a powerful example of how to challenge those orders, survive them, and even thrive within them. Like many, if not all of us here tonight, I've been thinking a lot about fascism and would like to see what possibilities the archive of STAR offers for expanding our historical and political imagination around how fascism works and how we can resist it. So I'll do tonight what I've always done and put STAR in strange affinities with people that its members presumably had no relation, the pantheon of writers that make up the Black radical tradition, and that formidable roundtable of German critics and theorists known as the Frankfurt School. Here's Marsha standing on a street corner, dressed in a fur coat, handing out flyers to passersby. It's a photo from the 1971 protest at NYU's Weinstein Hall. Sylvia and Marsha founded STAR shortly after this demonstration, one waged over the school's treatment of its queer students. As the writer, Ain't Nothing, says, quote, the university had refused to allow gay dances organized by a gay student group to occur on campus, so gay liberationists occupied the hall and held a sit-in. The arrival of the tactical police force caused the gay liberationists to abandon the occupation, end quote. Reflecting on the moment when the tactical police came, Sylvia said, quote, "All that we fought for at Weinstein Hall was lost when we left upon the request of the pigs. Chalk one up for the pigs, for they truly are carrying their victory flag," end quote. Ain't Nothing asserts again, quote, "Star, initially called Street Transvestites for Gay Power, was born of the frustration with the gay liberation movement for its refusal to defend itself and be committed to struggle against the police," end quote. In addition to a struggle against the police, we might situate the Weinstein Hall protests and the participation of the police's tactical forces within the use of police and military forces to suppress popular insurgencies in the US and abroad, and to the rise of fascist tendencies within this country. In fact, the same year that the Weinstein Hall demonstration took place, Angela Davis would release the anthology, If They Come in the Morning, Voices of Resistance. In their preface to the book, she and the political activist and author Bettina Aptheker discussed the cloud of police repression that had descended upon the nation. They wrote, quote, "Police repression in the United States has reached monstrous proportions. Black and brown peoples, especially victims of the most calculated forms of class, national, and racial oppression, bear the brunt of this repression. Literally, tens and thousands of innocent men and women, the overwhelming majority of them poor, fill the jails and prisons. Hundreds of thousands more, including the most presumably respectable groups and individuals, are subject to police, FBI, and military intelligence surveillance," end quote. As concerning as police repression was for Davis and Aptheker, it was also part of a larger disturbance, that of fascism. They wrote, quote, "Many people in the progressive and radical movements have tended, especially in recent months, as the repression has become increasingly intense, to view this intensity as a measure of the fascist nature of the government," end quote. Connecting the specificities of fascism to marginalized and politicized populations, they went on to say, quote, "It is essential to view fascist tendencies in terms of their specific challenge to working people. And in the United States, their specific challenge in the first place to the most exploited and at the same time most radical and politically conscious section of the working class, Black, Puerto Rican, and Chicano communities," end quote. Not content to read fascism as a category inapplicable to liberal governments, Davis and Aptheker engaged fascism as a response to the insurgency and diversity of working classes within the US, a response that relied on the expansion and militarization of police forces. Fascism, Davis and Aptheker implied, represents an attempt to discipline that insurgency and its related diversity. For this reason, they wrote, quote, "The pivotal struggle to be waged among working people is the open, aggressive, uncompromising battle against all manifestations of racism," end quote. If fascism targets insurgent diversities, then anti-fascism must encourage their mobilization. We might observe groups and histories like the one offered by Starr as an example of the critical diversity of working class populations and as a provocation to innovate our understanding of how anti-fascist struggles must involve intersectional struggles against transphobia in particular. Marcia remembered how she, Sylvia, Bambi Lamour, and Andorra Marks, also members of STAR, were featured in an article for the Village Voice about the home that they would eventually rent on 213 East 2nd Street. "We all gave our names, Bambi, Andorra, Marcia, and Sylvia," she said. "And we all went out to hustle, about a few days after the article came out in the Village Voice. And you see, we get busted one after another in a matter of a couple of weeks. I don't know whether it was the article or whether we just got busted because it was hot. If the arrest took place in response to the coverage about Star in the Village Voice, then it affirms the argument that police repression must be understood in relation to the insurgencies within poor and working class communities. But given what Marcia just said, we must understand police power as a tripartite repression as well. It was a repression of the critical discourses that the Star members produced. It was also a repression of transgender modes of difference. It was lastly a repression of sex work. These were the specific challenges that fascism held for members of transgender communities of that day. "My name is Seymour Pine," the officer said. "In 1968, I was assigned as deputy inspector in charge of public morals in the 1st Division in the police department, which covered the Greenwich Village area. It was the duty of public morals to enforce all laws concerning vice and gambling, including prostitution, narcotics, and laws and regulations concerning homosexuality," end quote. The interview is printed in Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, Survival, Revolt, and Queer Antagonist Struggle, the zine that Ain't Nothing put together in 2019. In the interview, Officer Pine specifies how police powers represented an absolute authority to intrude upon trans life. He said, quote, "The part of the penal code which applied to drag queens was section 240.35, section 4. Being masked or in any manner disguised by unusual or unnatural attire or facial alteration, loiters, remains, or congregates in a public place with other persons so masked." He understood very clearly the kinds of latitude that the penal code gave him and other officers. And you say, okay, you're not a man, you're a woman, or you're vice versa, and you wait over there. I mean, this was the kind of power that you have, and you never gave it a second thought. Whether he knew it or not, Officer Pine touched on what Eric Stanley has characterized as, quote, "one of the primary ordering principles of modernity," end quote, the capacity of the prison and the police to produce the gender binary. And if transness has been the site of an exhaustive classification of the sexual and gendered body in relation to orientation, norms, and identity, as Jack Halberstam has argued, then police powers were part of that classification. Marcia described the particular way that the police arrested trans women involved in STAR for their sex work and their activism. They just come up and grab you. One transvestite they grabbed right out of her lover's arms and took her down. Here, she points to the summary discretion that police possessed in violently claiming the lives of trans activists and sex workers, a summary discretion that was specifically and simultaneously for the police a racial, gender, class, and sexual dispensation. Describing the summary discretion exercised by police in San Francisco's Tenderloin in the 1960s, Susan Stryker writes, quote, "The police could be especially vicious to street queens, whom they considered bottom of the barrel sex workers and who were the least able to complain about mistreatment. Transgender women working the streets were often arrested on suspicion of prostitution, even if they were just going to the corner store or talking with friends. They might be driven around in squad cars for hours, forced to perform oral sex, strip searched, or after arriving at the jail, humiliated in front of other prisoners," end quote. In this passage about the summary discretion of San Francisco police, Stryker identifies just a fraction of what C. Riley Snorton and Jen Harita-Warren have theorized as the specific circumstances of bio and necropolitics for trans people disenfranchised by race and class. Explaining the operations of summary discretion In the context of Blacks at the early part of the 20th century, the African-American activist and intellectual Ida B. Wells told of the arrest of two colored men in New Orleans who had been just sitting upon the doorsteps for a short time talking together. She said, they had not broken the peace in any way whatever. No warrant was in the policeman's hands justifying their arrest, and no crime had been committed of which they were the suspects, end quote. Turning to their discretionary powers, she continued, quote, secure in the firm belief that they could do anything to a Negro that they wished, they approached the two men, and in less than 3 minutes from the time they accosted them, attempted to put both colored men under arrest, end quote. Discussing Wells Barnett's argument, the carceral studies scholar Brian Wagner says, quote, this structural vulnerability to police violence described by Wells Barnett has remained a constant feature of public life in the United States, end quote. The scene that Marcia describes in which the members of STAR and the other sex workers were snatched from the street is part of the very history that Wells Barnett invokes, one in which the summary discretion of the police makes marginalized groups vulnerable to structural violence. You could do anything to a Negro you wished, said Wells Barnett. They just come up and grab you, Marcia replied. Sylvia said that one of the first times the Star Banner was unfurled was in a march against police repression with the Young Lords Party, that famous organization of Puerto Rican revolutionaries that, in the words of former members Iris Morales and Denise Oliver Valles, believed, quote, deep in our hearts in the power of poor people to change the world, end quote. Remembering the Young Lords, Sylvia said, anytime they needed help, I was always there for the Young Lords. It was just the respect they gave us as human beings, end quote. Right around that time, she met Huey Newton, co-founder of the Black Panther Party at the People's Revolutionary Convention in 1971. Indeed, Newton would write his famous communique, Women's and Gay Liberation, during that time, arguing, quote, maybe a homosexual could be the most revolutionary, end quote. Remembering Newton's message fondly, Sylvia said, Huey decided we were part of the revolution, that we were revolutionary people. It is important to situate the Young Lords and the Black Panthers' relative embrace of queer and trans folk within their organizations' revision of the Marxist notion of the lumpen proletariat. As geographer and ethnic studies scholar Laura Polito argued, the hallmark of the Black Panther Party's politics was its emphasis on the lumpen proletariat, or what today might be called the underclass. While the Black Panthers and the Young Lords claimed certain aspects of Marxism, they had important deviations. As Polito states, quote, traditionally, Marxism had placed the greatest agency in the working class, while the lumpen proletariat had been dismissed as unorganizable, lacking class consciousness, and out for themselves, end quote. Indeed, Marx and Engels described the lumpen proletariat in the Communist Manifesto as, quote, the dangerous class, the social scum, that passively rotting mass thrown off by the lowest layers of old society may here and there be swept into the movement by a proletarian revolution. Its conditions of life, however, prepare it far more for the part of a bribed tool of reactionary intrigue, end quote. In many ways, the histories of the Young Lords and the Black Panthers expose the respectability politics of Marxism, its bifurcation of the poor into the respectable and potentially revolutionary proletariat, and the disreputable and lethally apolitical lumpen proletariat. By constructing the lumpen proletariat as indecent, the rotting mass they call them, Marx and Engels not only connoted a social insignificance, but a historical and political one as well. Unlike the respectable proletariat, the lumpen proletariat would never change history, nor would they leave anything behind. They were the beggars, prostitutes, procurers, and scavengers, the queer ones, not the coal miner, the iron worker, the stocking maker, and the silk weaver, the virtuous working class who would usher in the revolution. As houseless and trans sex workers, Starr conformed not to the notion of the proletariat, but to that of the lumpen proletariat. Indeed, one might argue that at that time, trans and queer people were relegated to lumpen ranks since sodomy laws and vice commissions had effectively criminalized homosexuality and transness. While most Marxists consigned the beggars and prostitutes to the dustbin of history, and in this sense, thought alongside rather than against sodomy laws and vice, the Black Panthers and the Young Lords had other ideas. They, in the words of Polito, quote, reversed this long-standing tradition by naming the lumpen proletariat as the revolutionary vanguard, end quote. It is likely that this was part of the context for Newton's communique and the Young Lords' embrace of Starr, why perhaps the Panthers and the Young Lords could, as a matter of policy, identify trans sex workers and queers as potential revolutionaries. As the Panthers and the Young Lords challenged the othering of the lumpen proletariat, they defied fascist violence in ways that conventional Marxism could not. Indeed, as Marxism othered the lumpen proletariat, it made itself available rather than resistant to fascist logics. In the authoritarian personality, the Frankfurt School intellectual Theodor Adorno stated, "It is one of the favorite devices of fascist agitators to compare outgroup all foreigners, and particularly refugees and Jews, with low animals and vermins," end quote. Challenging fascism would mean finding value in the lives of people who have been considered by conservatives and radicals alike the scum of society. The founding of Starr and similar groups was an announcement that there are members of the lumpen proletariat who are plenty capable of challenging fascism. These groups also suggested that as long as we divide the poor between the enlightened and the benighted, the virtuous and the sinful, we will unwittingly provide fascism with the resource that it needs. Another Frankfurt School intellectual, Walter Benjamin, said, "For the historical materialist, there is no major or minor event." We might add that for a fully realized radicalism, there are no major or minor peoples. You know this photo. This is Sylvia speaking in 1973 at the Christopher Street Liberation Day rally. It's the speech in which she claims righteous anger at the wave of assimilation and normativity overtaking queer communities. To a partly hostile crowd, she cried out, quote, "My half-sisters and brothers are being raped and murdered by pigs, straights, and even sometimes by other uptight homosexuals who consider us the scum of the gay community," end quote. She pinpoints the everydayness of transphobic violence. Indeed, the varied histories of the minoritized can be the basis for revising our understanding of the quotidian rather than the exceptional nature of social violence, and how that quotidian nature makes up the building blocks of fascism. Such revisions, the theorist Alberto Toscano has argued recently, demonstrate the way that, quote, fascism and democracy can be experienced very differently by different segments of the population, end quote. This observation has been central to Black radical traditions. It was the Martinican intellectual, Aimé Césaire, who, for instance, helped to locate colonialism as a building block for Nazism. He said, quote, First, we must study how colonization worked to decivilize the colonizer, to brutalize him in the true sense of the word. First, we must study how colonization works to decivilize the colonizer. To brutalize him in the true sense of the word, to degrade him, to awaken him to buried instincts, to covetousness, violence, race hatred, and moral relativism. For Césaire, as for many Black writers and artists, colonialism represented the withering of the colonizer's humanity. This withering was to a large degree achieved by the social acceptance of everyday and institutionalized violence and marginalization. Césaire said, and we must show that each time a head is cut off or an eye put out in Vietnam and in France, they accept the fact. Each time a little girl is raped and in France, they accept the fact. Each time a Madagascan is tortured and in France, they accept the fact. Civilization acquires another dead weight. A universal regression takes place. A gangrene sets in. A center of infection begins to spread. And that at the end of all of these treaties that have been violated, all these lies that have been propagated, all these punitive expeditions that have been tolerated, all these prisoners who have been tied up and interrogated, all these patriots who have been tortured, at the end of all the racial pride that has been encouraged, all the boastfulness that has been displayed, a poison has been distilled into the veins of Europe. And slowly but surely, the continent proceeds towards savagery, end quote. Nazism, Césaire argued, was not the antithesis of Western civilization, but because of colonialism and the acceptance of it, another expression of Western civilization. In the everydayness of transphobic violence, we also find Western civilization expressing itself and ordering economically and racially marginalized trans people to the bottom of the social hierarchy. These circumstances shed light on how fascist violence that is articulated in the context of trans sex workers is accepted because of their taken for granted marginalization. Rivera's outcry at the Christopher Street Liberation Day implores us to consider how fascism recruits us into its regimes of acceptance. The Star House was a tenement on 213 East 2nd Street. Not that much is known about it really, but there's enough to produce meaning. This is a 1939 tax photo from the Municipal Archives. The original building was torn down in the 1980s. Arthur Bell, the Village Voice writer that Marcia mentioned, described it as a, quote, dilapidated hellhole of a building, end quote. Sylvia remembers it this way. We had a star house, a place for all of us to sleep. It was only 4 rooms and the landlord had turned the electricity off. So we lived there by candlelight, a floating bunch of 15 to 25 queens cramped in those rooms with all our wardrobe, but it worked. The Weinstein Hall demonstration gave birth to the house. The members of STAR threw a fundraiser with the Gay Liberation Front and gay youth from NYU and raised enough money to rent the tenement from the mafia for $300 a month. Along with Marcia and Sylvia, there was Bambi Lamour, a Black trans woman that Sylvia befriended while spending time at Rikers, specifically in the cell block reserved for gay crimes, according to the scholar and activist Jesse Gann. Sylvia and Bambi were a pair while they did time at Rikers. Nobody ever fucked with us, she said. There was also Andora Marks, another Black trans woman, Bubbles Rose Lee, who helped to occupy Weinstein Hall, and Bibi Scarpino, who would go on to direct the Queens Liberation Front, and others that just needed a place. According to Ceci Kuwabara Blanchard, quote, they made the place home, reviving the defunct boiler with a bit of elbow grease, decorating the walls with posters, demanding political prisoners' liberation, and filling the home with puppies that roam floors dotted with empty Hawaiian punch cans, end quote. Everybody, queens and puppies, had a chance at sanctuary. Sanctuary. According to the scholar and activist A. Naomi Paik, the word sanctuary means, quote, a holy place and a place that offers refuge, end quote. While it first originated out of religious context, sanctuary is, quote, not restricted to any specific religious tradition or even to people, end quote. Explaining its historic consciousness, Pate goes on to say, quote, places of refuge include nature preserves and protected zones for animals endangered by human encroachments. The concept thus enables us to see the mutual need for protection shared by the human and natural worlds, end quote. As a designated harbor for the human and the non-human, the Star House provided a hallowed ground for targeted peoples, for the houseless person, the sex worker, the radical, and the four-legged. It was the safe refuge, the best refuge. Having gone to that refuge, a trans woman could be delivered from pain. There, they made a sanctuary so that a new esteem might dwell among them, full of blessing and guidance. Whoever entered the house attained security, for a time, it seems. Sanctuary. Sylvia said, Marcia and I and Bubbles and Andorra and Bambi kept that building going by selling ourselves out on the streets while trying to keep the children off the streets. And a lot of them made good. A lot of them went home. Some of them I lost. They went to the streets. We lost them, but we tried to do the best we could for them, end quote. Describing the ways that they helped each other survive, she said, quote, the contribution of the ones who didn't make it out into the streets, who wanted something different, was to liberate food from in front of the A&P and places like that, because back then they used to leave everything out in front of the store before it opened. So the house was well supplied, the building's rent was paid, and everybody in the neighborhood loved Star House, end quote. Sylvia told of the ways that the Star House became a harbor for the people in the neighborhood as well. They were impressed because they could leave their kids and we'd babysit with them, she said. If they were hungry, we fed them. We fed half of the neighborhood because we had an abundance of food the kids liberated. It was a revolutionary thing. We might situate what Star did within the history of mutual aid. Defining that history, Dean Spade argues, quote, mutual aid is a collective coordination to meet each other's needs, usually from an awareness that the systems we have in place are not going to meet them, end quote. For Spade, mutual aid is, quote, done in conjunction with social movements and is a means of demanding transformative change. The mutual aid that Star was producing pointed to the inadequacies of a nation and a world that make housing, transportation, healthy food, daycare, healthcare, and safe work into privileges rather than rights. Perhaps invoking the spirit of Césaire, the members of Star seem to say, we will neither accept our degradation nor theirs. Who knows? Maybe the Star members took their inspiration from the Black Panthers and the Young Lords. Those organizations invented childcare centers for the people, free breakfast programs for the children, and clothing drives for the poor, doing so out of a smack to the face understanding that neither state nor capital would supply the resources to those in need. Describing their philosophy, the Young Lords said, quote, as servants of the people, revolutionaries, we have committed ourselves wholeheartedly to the development of our nation, of Borinquen and all humanity, end quote. Then again, they may have also been inspired by the San Francisco-based group Vanguard, which was made up of gay male and transgender female youth, many of whom were sex workers. In one of their demonstrations, a street sweeping party, they reclaimed the streets and their identities, naming for San Francisco the seeds of what Lisa Dugan has described as neoliberalism's upward redistribution of resources. Vanguard's press release stated, quote, "Tonight, a clean sweep will be made on Market Street, not by the police, but the street people who are often subject to police harassment, the drug addicts, pillheads, teenage hustlers, lesbians, and homosexuals who make San Francisco's meat rack their home and are tired of living in the midst of filth thrown out onto the sidewalks and into the streets by nearby businessmen," end quote. In the spirit of the Young Lords, the Black Panthers, and Vanguard, and all the girls who saw to one another, the Star House offered itself for revolutionary service, committing itself wholeheartedly to the development of living beings within and around the house. In his 1972 book, Counter-Revolution and Revolt, another Frankfurt School theorist, Herbert Marcuse, argued, quote, "Fascism is the counter-revolution to the socialist transformation of society," end quote. The raids, police roundups, murders, rapes, and economic devastation were all part of a counter-revolution tailored for the lumpen assemblage represented by Starr and others like them. They were targeted precisely because they, contrary to Marxist presumptions, were engaged in revolutionary service. It is this service that fascism finds most threatening. As Alberto Toscano again argues, quote, "While nominally mobilized against the threat of armed insurrection, the ultimate target of insurrection were those experiments with social life outside and against the racial state," end quote. If Starr was engaged in a kind of freedom dream, as the artist Tourmaline has suggested, then fascism would emerge from the shadows and attempt to destroy the fruit of that dream work. As lumpen revolutionaries, the Starr members, for a spell at least, produced a kind of utopian community, not a utopia that was unrealizable, but one that was imminent within the house and its members. The theorist Avery Gordon has theorized utopia by saying, quote, "The utopian is not the future as some absolute break from the past and the present out there. It is in us, a way we conceive and live in the here and now, all those things we are and we do that exceed or are just not expressions of what is dominant and dominating us," end quote. In this now, one characterized by a creeping fascism that threatens to overtake our present, we are called to conceive and live other nows. At the very least, the histories of queer and trans liberation provide us a chance to represent the unexpected social agents who were opposing fascist modes of power. In their full appreciation, these histories encourage us to meet each other's needs and to demand social change. There, in the lumpen household, filled with queens who floated from room to room and with puppies that played and snuggled, we might find our model and inspiration. Thank you so, so much.
I'm a loss for words, Dr. Ferguson. Thank you so much. I want to, just say a couple of things before, as we transition to the Q&A. Again, just thank you so much for your riveting and moving words tonight that speak not only to our historical struggles and really remind us that the fight today must continue, right, for our equity, respect, and acceptance. And in these movements in history, and I love how the importance of history that I think oftentimes gets forgotten as we move and look at different social movements. But even if it's not given to us, we must demand it, and we must take what is ours. You call us to action and force us to call out folks both within and outside of our community when they ignore, dismiss, and overlook our families, and knowing that utopia is already here within us. Thank you again. And I just want to thank you for letting us be a part of this evening and to honestly, truly bask in your brilliance.
Thank you.
So next, we will be transitioning to our Q&A segment. While we're gathering the questions and different various inquiries, I would like to ask our CLAG's board co-chair, Dr. Dasgupta, to please join us.
Hi there. Hi, Justin. Thank you for bringing me on briefly. First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Roderick, Ferguson, Rod. You made me cry. All of you, the testimonials, this was such an amazing love fest. And all of you show us how to work together and create community and hold each other up. In all kinds of settings, but definitely in academic setting. And so we can keep producing stellar work. So thank you for that. I wanted to quickly give an update on the fundraiser and thank everybody who has donated thus far. I am told we have had 12 donors already and we have raised $1,850. Boo, boo. So, you know, that really, I feel like I'm on one of those radio fundraising things, you know, repetitively they keep asking for money, but that's my job as board co-chair. I just wanted to say that the $1,850 will go a long way in funding the Dissertation to Book Award, as well as Student Travel Award. If there has been 12 donors thus far, I would love for us to get 12 more donors today to give just $100. And with $1,200, I would fully fund the Sylvia Rivera Studies, the Award for Transgender Studies. Since we've heard so much from Rod about the revolutionary potential for trans activism and trans studies, we at CLAGS are committed to supporting the work of trans scholars and trans scholarship. So I welcome you to contribute. We're looking for 12 more people to give $100. And you can chat and let us know. And thank you if you've given to us. Thank you if you have not given, but you're here. You are more important than the contribution, because CLAGS is committed to free public programming. I love you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dabanush. So with that, if you all do have questions or comments, I ask that you can place them in the Q&A and we will begin. And certainly if there are any of the testimonial speakers or other panelists this evening, certainly feel free to also turn on your camera and mic as well. I will start off.
Okay.
So I do have, so in one thing that really, captured me and is thinking about, you know, this moment, and I spoke to it again when I mentioned it about the importance of history and historical context and what that means. How would you view the importance of that in a larger landscape as we continue to do this work to kind of remember as well as highlight and push forward? And because so many times when we look at this, it seems so cyclical, right? We haven't, we take steps forward, but how far have we really come? And so if you could just speak to like the importance that you see that playing, and it has to be in our mind as we, force and fight for social change.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I've been really, really encouraged and excited by the kind of archival work that younger activists are doing, to return to these histories to see what they can learn from around them. So, I mean, if you think about, kind of old Marxist concept of praxis, where like you combine theory and activism, so that the activism is informed by, theoretical insights, we can kind of see this moment, where people are returning to and dusting off the old histories as a kind of praxis, that will guide, their activism in this moment, whether it's, against police violence in favor of abolition or against, sort of structural racism or the ongoing violence of settler colonialism. There is a return to, the sort of historical ground, to the old landmarks that I really believe is, like that's the medicine we need, at this moment. Because the history is out, the history is out there. It's saying to us, we have everything we need. The resources are at hand. All we got to do is access it. And so I think that to the question of what you were saying about they seem like cycles, like we seem to be back where we were again. The thing to remember and to observe is that, we're not on a linear track, with this stuff. There will be advances, there will be setbacks. One, two, we also do these things for not just ourselves, but for the generations that come, unto the seventh generation, right? And so we have to have a long view of the struggle. That's how we get through it. I can't hear you, babe. You're on mute.
Thank you so much. And that is important, right? That I think that having that long view is so important. Thank you very much. So we do have a question and comment from Daniel Duncan. Rod, how did you propel yourself out of rural Georgia? And can you speak to your drive to educate yourself and your experiences of struggle and success?
Sure. I had wonderful, wonderful teachers, who were formal teachers and also the informal teachers back home. And I mean, I was really, nurtured, but I wasn't the only one who was nurtured. My friends were nurtured, my cousins were nurtured. As soon as people saw people, meaning Black people primarily, saw that we had promise, they did everything they could to produce the conditions for the realization of that promise. It was, it was a community in all senses of that word, where people, really made a project out of, taking, these fledgling minds and sometimes rude kids and working with us. And so, you know, I mean, they launched me. They launched me, they launched my cousins, they launched my friends. And so I'm in no way exceptional, you know, in that regard. One, and, you know, it was that. I mean, you know, there is something to, I mean, I read somewhere that one of the main ingredients of creativity, or one of the main sort of catalysts for creativity, is encouragement, you know, that simple thing. And so there was a culture of encouragement, you know, in my hometown and in that community, people.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Next, how do you envision institutions moving forward with queer politics as we embark on a post-George Floyd and anti-racism statement reality?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something I tried to touch on in the reorder of things, right? That institutions will do what they are doing now, you know, and that is claiming, you know, the affirmations, you know, so it's Lyft and Uber using the sign Black Lives Matter, you know, at the same time that Lyft and Uber have just passed policy and in California and are talking about doing something similar in other states whereby they strip their workers of rights and protections. So there's that. I think we have to be clear about our difference from that, you know, when we claim, you know, histories of anti-racism, histories of feminism, histories of queerness, that it is not something to be delivered to the institution itself. It is something that we must use to produce communities of struggle that are outside the institution or in the institution, but not of it. You know? And again, there are models for that, you know, for how to do that, you know, whether we're talking about like the freedom schools, or we're talking about STAR, or we're talking about, you know, the artist collectives. There are models for that. So in order to achieve that kind of counter institutionality, we have to go back to class.
From Maya, from someone who has finally found their gender identity, non-binary, and sexuality, bisexual, Dr. Ferguson, how did you truly find yours, especially in this heteronormative environment in the South? I feel like my life has begun in 2020 because I finally found who I am.
Well, congratulations, first of all. Well, you know, I mean, you have to understand that, you know, people, some of my friends reference this in the Sissies at the Picnic article. I was never not around queerness, you know, or transness either when I was growing up. And that's how I understood what a neighborhood is, that everybody's there, you know? And in fact, I began that article, that essay, you know, in one of the versions, the idea that white people can be queer is still an adjustment for me, because my first introduction to queerness and to transness was through Black folks, okay? In that neighborhood, in that county, you know, not just talking about my hometown, but everywhere, all the other towns as well. And so it was not an invention, you know, from scratch, you know, for me. In fact, you know, when I really began to kind of claim queerness, I reached back for those folks, you know, for their commitment to community, for their commitment to service, for their commitment to politics, for their fabulousness. you know, they were my models. The folks in those little towns, you know, were my models, and they continue to be.
Well, I know we are approaching time, and I know we didn't get to a ton of the questions. But in respect of your time and of others, we thank you. And again, certainly what we can do is, you know, coalesce these questions and kind of get those to you as well. And we can move forward and maybe getting some of those responses.
That would be great. Would you also save the chat
Yes.
for me as well? Because I've just been looking up every now and then, reading, you know, what people are putting in the chat. Like, I didn't know you knew about this, or, you know, so that would be great. You know, it's people I haven't seen in years, you know, somehow heard about this.
We will, definitely. And so before we close out, I do wish we were in person, but I do want to take this opportunity again to thank you. It is an honor to have you here and to have been able to honor you with the 2020 Kessler Award for your significant contributions to the field of LGBTQ studies. So thank you again. Words cannot express the overwhelming joy that it has been to have you here, and also an overwhelming nomination by our board for you as the recipient of this award as well.
No, thank you so much. And I would also like to say, you know, when Toni Morrison, not to say that this is my Toni Morrison Nobel Prize moment, but when Toni Morrison won the Nobel Prize, she said this thing, "It is an honor shared among us." And she was talking about, you know, her friends. And so I really feel that this is an honor shared among us. This isn't really just about me. This is an honor shared amongst all of us and the work that we have all done. You know, so I thank you, and I thank the board, and I thank everyone on this Zoom, you know, for the work that you have done.
Thank you. Dr. Dasgupta, or if also I would ask that if, you know, any of the other testimonial speakers, those of us that on here as other panelists, if you would just turn your cameras on, and we can do a virtual congratulations.
Wild applause. Woohoo!
Congratulations.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so
That
much.
was exquisite and brilliant, Rod. Just what we needed for our time.
No, love to all of you.
Play and snatch.
Love to all.
Oh, so beautiful.
Thank you to everyone. So wonderful.
Any last
Good
Good night.
All right.
Just wanted to thank all our interns, the staff of
Yes, thank
CLAGS,
you.
Yasmina, Justin, Sid, all our interns who worked with us, graduate assistants, Jordan, thank you. And thank you to the closed captioning person and to John who worked with us. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Rod. Thank you for all the testimonials, everybody. This is truly inspiring for our times.
Thank you. Lots of love.
Good night.
Bye. Good night.
Bye.
This will be available on the internet soon. It'll also be closed captioned, and we'll make the chat available to you as well as the videos to all of you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
John, I just have one follow-up question.